The bell above the door chimed, a thin, cheerful sound that was immediately swallowed by the heavy thud of combat boots on linoleum. The diner was caught in that gray, suspended hour of Tuesday morning, where the world felt made of wet wool and old coffee. At the counter, Jaden was steadying a stack of ceramic mugs, her movements precise and rhythmic, when the air in the room suddenly curdled. "Everyone on the floor, now!" The scream was jagged, fueled by the kind of desperation that usually ended in a funeral. A man in a salt-stained black mask brandished a semi-automatic, his chest heaving as if he had run a mile just to build the courage to cross the threshold. In an instant, the mundane peace of the diner shattered. Two college students in the corner booth scrambled under their table, a tray of fries clattering to the floor like a rain of plastic. An old man near the window froze, his newspaper trembling in hands that had forgotten how to drop it. Jaden didn't move. She didn't drop the mugs. She didn't scream. The gunman pivoted, the barrel of the weapon swinging wildly before finding its mark. He lunged across the counter, shoving the cold, oily metal of the muzzle against Jaden's temple. It was a hard, bruising contact, the kind that should have sent her heart into a frantic gallop. Instead, she simply tilted her head. Her gaze drifted toward the gunman's hand. "You're shaking," she said. Her voice wasn't a plea or a whisper. It was a flat, clinical observation, delivered with the same tone she used to tell a customer they were out of sourdough. "It's going to go off by accident." In the back booth, shrouded by the dim light and the steam of his own untouched cup, Yoon Se-yoon watched. He was a man who lived in the silence between heartbeats, a predator who recognized the smell of genuine threat. He saw the gunman's panic, the wide, frantic eyes behind the mask, the white-knuckled grip. But his focus was anchored on the woman in the white uniform. She wasn't brave. Brave people felt fear and conquered it. Jaden looked as if she had simply opted out of the emotion entirely, her face a mask of calm, steady defiance. "Open the register," the robber barked, his voice cracking. He pressed the gun harder against her skin. Jaden looked through him, her pupils unblinking, her breathing deep and even while the rest of the room gasped for air. "There's barely $200 in there," she replied, her low, steady melody cutting through his hysteria. "You're risking 20 years for a few weeks of rent. You should have picked a different morning." In the corner, Se-yoon's hand stopped halfway to his coffee cup. That cadence, that refusal to be small, it hit him like a physical blow. The world around him compressed, the robbery fading into a blurred background. He knew that voice. He had heard it once before, in the dark, when he was certain the world was ending. The following morning, the diner felt different, hollowed out, as if the violence of the day before had sucked the soul from the walls. Jaden arrived for her shift at 5 a.m., her hair in its usual tight bun, ready to lose herself in the mindless rhythm of the morning rush. But the heavy glass door was locked. A small printed sign from management informed the staff that the unfortunate events had rendered the establishment a liability. Her manager, a man who had never looked her in the eye, met her at the back entrance with a final paycheck and a refusal to even say her name. She was a magnet for trouble, he claimed, and his insurance wouldn't cover a waitress who stared down gun barrels without blinking. Jaden took the envelope without a word. Her hyper-independence was a cold, hard shell. She had lost everything before, and she knew how to walk away from a wreck. She spent the afternoon in her cramped apartment, calculating how many weeks of nothingness she could afford before the family debt found her again. By the next dawn, she returned to the street to collect her remaining personal belongings, expecting to find the windows boarded up. Instead, the neon open sign was buzzing with a fierce electric life. The smell of fresh coffee and expensive wood polish drifted onto the sidewalk. When she pushed through the door, the peeling linoleum was gone, replaced by slate-gray stone. But behind the counter, her red apron was folded neatly next to a brand-new espresso machine. Yoon Se-joon was sitting in the same back booth, his presence a heavy, undeniable gravity that anchored the entire room. He didn't look like a customer this time. He looked like the architect of the world. The previous owner was a coward, Yoon said, his voice low and resonating through the empty space. I saw a liability. I saw an investment. Jaden stood by the door, her hands curling into fists at her sides. I told you I don't want your help, Mr. Yoon. I don't want to be anyone's project. You aren't a project, Yoon replied, standing up and walking toward her until the scent of rain and expensive silk overwhelmed the kitchen grease. He held out a set of keys, not just to the register, but to the building itself. You saved a life worth more than this entire block. I don't give gifts, Jaden. I settle debts. He placed the keys on the counter. The diner is mine. Your job is exactly where you left it. You can pretend you don't know me, but you will no longer be made small by men with guns or managers with no spine. The rain 3 years ago hadn't been a drizzle. It was a deluge that turned the city's alleyways into slick, obsidian rivers. Jaden had been walking home from a double shift, her feet aching and her mind a dull hum of exhaustion, when she smelled it, the sharp, metallic tang of blood cutting through the scent of wet concrete. She had followed the sound of ragged, wet breathing to a stack of waterlogged crates, where a man in a ruined silk suit lay crumpled like discarded refuse. Yoon Se-yoon had been unrecognizable then, his face pale as bone under the flickering light of a dying street lamp. A jagged wound in his side pulsed with a rhythmic, terrifying life of its own, staining his white shirt a deep, visceral crimson. Most people would have kept walking, their hearts hammered by the instinct to survive. Some would have called the police and vanished. Jaden had done neither. She had knelt in the filth, her cheap coat instantly soaking through as she pressed her bare hands against the heat of the wound. She didn't flinch when his hand, slick with gore, suddenly clamped onto her wrist with a dying man's strength. She had simply looked into his glazed, dark eyes, eyes that usually commanded empires, but were now pleading for a single extra minute of air. "Stay with me," she had whispered. It wasn't a soft comfort, it was a command, delivered with that same low, steady melody that defied the chaos of the world. For 4 hours she had sat in that alleyway, using her own scarf to bind the wound and her own warmth to fight back the shock that tried to claim him. She had watched his chest rise and fall, counting the seconds between his heartbeats as if she could keep him alive through sheer willpower. But as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the skyline, the sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed from the street. Men with the same cold, predatory energy as the one she had saved. Jaden knew that world. She knew that the debt of a man like this was a leash she could never afford to wear. She had waited until his breathing stabilized, until his fingers finally went limp against her wrist. Before the first black car could turn into the alley, she stood, wiped the blood from her hands onto the brick wall, and vanished into the shadows. She had saved his life not for a reward, but because she refused to let the world take one more thing while she was watching.
And then, true to the ghost she had become, she had run before he could ever learn her name.
The newly renovated diner was quiet, the air smelling of expensive cedar and the sharp, clean bite of fresh espresso. Jaden moved behind the counter with the same robotic efficiency she had always possessed, though the weight of the silver keys in her apron pocket felt like a brand. She had tried to treat the morning like any other, but the nothingness she craved was fraying at the edges. The chime above the door didn't ring with the lightness of a customer. It rattled against the frame as 3 men pushed inside. They didn't dive for cover or scream like the amateur from the robbery. They walked with the heavy, arrogant gait of men who owned the streets and the people on them. The leader, a man named Kyron with a face like pitted stone, stopped at the counter and leaned over, his shadow extinguishing the light on Jaden's workspace.
2 years, Jaden, Kyron rasped, his voice a low crawl of malice. You thought a new coat of paint and a fancy espresso machine would hide the fact that your father still owes us for the sins he left behind.
Jaden didn't look up from the cup she was polishing. Her hands remained steady, though a cold, familiar dread began to coil in her stomach. I don't have his money, she said, her voice maintaining its flat, clinical melody. And I don't have his life. Leave. Kyron laughed, a dry sound that grated like sandpaper. He reached out, his thick fingers closing around her wrist, intending to pull her across the counter to make her small again. A waitress doesn't tell us what to do. You're coming with us. We'll find a way to work off that debt that doesn't involve pouring coffee. He expected her to scream. He expected her to plead. Instead, he saw her gaze shift past his shoulder, her eyes reflecting a sudden, glacial stillness. I wouldn't do that, a voice vibrated from the back booth. The room seemed to shrink. Yoon Sejun stood up, his dark suit absorbing the light, his presence a suffocating pressure that made the 3 men instinctively reach for weapons they were suddenly too terrified to draw. He didn't look at Kyron. He looked only at the hand gripping Jaden's wrist. You are standing in my place of business, Sejun said, his tone lower than a growl, a promise of absolute ruin. And you are touching a woman who holds a debt you cannot afford to even name. Kyron's arrogance vanished, replaced by the realization that he had walked into a lion's den while looking for a mouse. He didn't know who Sejun was, but he knew the smell of a predator that could erase him from existence without breaking a sweat.
The tension in the diner didn't break, it curdled. Kyron let go of Jaden's wrist, his fingers twitching as he backed away from the suffocating aura of Yoon Sejun, but the sneer didn't leave his face. He knew he couldn't outmuscle the man in the suit, so he reached for the only weapon that could pierce a suit of armor made of ice. You think this ghost in a tie can protect everything you love, Jaden? Kyron spat, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a cracked cell phone. He slid an image across the marble counter. Elijah didn't make it to his first period class today. He's sitting in the back of a van, wondering why his big sister hasn't paid her bills. For the first time in 3 years, the world moved faster than Jaden could track. The ceramic mug she had been holding didn't just slip, it shattered against the floor, a sharp, violent explosion of white shards that mirrored the sudden fracturing of her composure. The calm waitress persona, the mask of clinical indifference she had worn like a shield, didn't just slip, it disintegrated. Her breath hitched, a jagged, raw sound that was the opposite of her usual steady melody. Her pupils dilated, her hands beginning to tremble with a frantic, uncoordinated energy that made her small and terrifyingly human. The hyper-independence that had been her fortress became a cage. "Where is he?" she choked out, her voice thin and high, stripped of her protective armor. She lunged across the counter, her fingers clawing at the phone, her face contorted in a mask of pure, visceral terror. She wasn't looking at the gun or the Mafia boss anymore. She was looking at the abyss. Sejun was at her side in a single, blurred movement, his hand steadying her shoulder. He felt the frantic heat radiating off her, the way her entire body was vibrating with a panic she no longer knew how to contain. The woman who had stared down a gun barrel without blinking was gone, replaced by a sister who was drowning in fear for her brother. "Look at me, Jaden," Sejun commanded, his voice a low, grounding anchor in her storm. But she couldn't. She was staring at Kyron, her eyes wide and wet, the ice finally melted into a flood of desperation. The armor had cracked, and for the first time, the ghost was bleeding.